Hello, my name is Henri Brink, and today I'll be presenting my thesis, An End After the End, analyzing Gothic themes and temporal subversion in Team Cherry's Hollow Knight. In Hollow Knight, you play as the Knight, a small, nameless anthropomorphic bug, as you can see going along the screen, who descends into Hollownest to face its dangers, its triumphs, and ultimately the infectious scourge which destroyed it. To do so, the game has a singular and very simple goal: wake the dreamers and defeat the Hollow Knight, taking in the infection and returning peace and safety to Hollownest. This narrative focus is steeped in themes of the Gothic, presenting a literalized confrontation of past and present in the game's Gothic architecture, aesthetic, and literal hauntings which occur throughout the game's playtime. As the player engages the Gothic space in a historicized present, it connects them both spiritually and physically to the past and the responsibilities contained therein. The linear space of the game begins to break down. It begins to sort of devolve into an atemporal frenzy. These atemporal spaces operate alongside and within the linear game space, questioning the validity of it being there altogether. Explorations of atemporality in the game take the effect often of explorations of queer time and temporality specifically, which utilize atemporal spaces throughout the game to expose the disruptive queerness in Hollow Knight's Gothic themes and aesthetics, and subvert the oppressive linearity of the primary narrative. In doing so, the game presents an alternative to the cyclical birth, sacrifice, and rebirth of that primary endpoint and goal, offering the player a freedom from the narrative and the infection and normative expectations of linearity altogether. To do so, it operates on three major facets. The first one is obviously the Metroidvania game design. As you can see behind me, the game really is a 3D sort of side-scrolling platformer that really encourages exploration with the game space. This exploration creates a sort of progression in the game and in the world around you, even as it doesn't explore the character themselves. The Knight does not have any speaking parts. Rather, the Knight imposes change and effects on the world around him as he gains power-ups, as he engages with characters. These characters go through growth, which would not have been possible without the Knight's intervention and exploration. The Knight as an operator of the past, existing from a past space now in the present, and interacting with people who may or may not have occurred or existed in the past space, explores these Gothic themes and shows how they break down as you begin to explore and exert influence on the space around you. The Gothic themes themselves operate on three primary facets. The first is to situate the player in an atmosphere of historical decay, done through areas such as the City of Tears, which evokes a kind of very Victorian 18th century or 18th century to Victorian Gothic space for the player. It's very familiar and it's very threatening, with sharp angles and parapets, which situate you in the space of historical danger. Second, the thematic elements of the Gothic are found throughout Hollow Knight and employ the aesthetic elements to thematically bring you into the narrative experience. These themes primarily drive the primary ending. They confront the past, they encourage you to confront the past yourself, and they really historicize this legacy that you seem to be obligated to be a part of. However, these elements also encourage exploration of underground tunnels, of secret entrances and areas, and aspects of the game which don't interact directly with the primary narrative, including, as I mentioned before, those atemporal spaces that really undermine the, I think on surface level, oppressive areas of the Gothic that might at first seem, oh, this history is really imposing itself on the player. Those atemporal spaces question that authority. And that's why, third, the narrative elements of the Gothic lead the player towards a more disruptive experience within the game space. And they push the player to look outside the boundaries of linear space and time and reject the constraints of both the world and the narrative itself. This is done again through those atemporal spaces, but also through warrior ghosts and atemporal elements impose themselves on the present game space, inviting them towards temporal subversion. That temporal subversion is that third part of my argument. Specifically, I'm looking at queer time and temporality as defined by Jack Halberstam, which really maps out temporality and linearity as a very heteronormative and very normative, generally, aspect of living. As he mentions, the normative model of youth cultures are stages on the way to adulthood. And having a queer temporality and queer temporal focus allows people to map out a different form and refuse that adulthood and that deliberative, sort of iterative way of thinking. In Hollow Knight, the atemporal spaces really serve to undermine the primary objective of the game and offer the opportunity to complete different endings. Those different endings often reject the idea of taking the infection, of taking in that historicity whatsoever, instead encouraging the player to engage with the game space and find an ending outside of the normative, find an ending outside of history. to engage with spaces that are completely outside the norm, to engage with the idea that instead of giving in to the history, of giving into legacy, you have the authority and you have the agency to engage with another outside force, to remove yourself altogether, to return to the void. And I think that's really powerful. I think that by reading a queer temporality and a queer idea and a queer ideology onto the text, it gives you a more fulfilled experience. And that is my thesis. And after the end, I really try to explore queer themes in the text and the ways that temporality subverts expectations. I look forward to all of your questions. Thank you so much for watching.